Hey, mama. So I've been working in the podcasting space for the past couple of years, slightly a little bit longer than that. And in that time, I've served over 50 women in launching, growing, and monetizing their podcasts. And one question I'm often asked is, how do I get more downloads? And that makes sense, right? Every time you open your podcast host, you're immediately faced with the number of downloads. Podcasters talk a lot about downloads. The thing is that downloads mean two different things for hobby podcasters versus business owners with a podcast. And so as a business owner, the question you really should be asking is, how many downloads does a podcast need to make money? And that's exactly what I'm answering today. All right, let's jump into today's episode. Hey, mama. Welcome to Marketing Without Socials for Moms, the go-to podcast for moms in business who want to stop relying on social media to build their business and build it in a way that fits their current season of life. I'm your host, Andria Singletary, a wife, mama of two, and visibility strategist for moms. Each week, I'm giving you the inside scoop on how to increase your visibility, leads, and sales through podcasting, email marketing, and collaborations. Ready to truly make social media optional in your business? Grab your chai tea latte and let's dive into today's episode. Okay, so before I answer this question, how many downloads does a podcast need to make money? I want to define what a download is to put things in perspective for you. So a podcast download is defined as when a phone or electronic device downloads an audio file, aka a podcast episode. However, just because someone downloads the audio file does not mean they listen to it. And just because someone doesn't download your podcast episode doesn't mean they haven't listened to it. Now, there are also metrics called streams and listens. Streams or listens indicate that someone has pushed play on a podcast episode and has listened to it for about 60 seconds or so. This is what we actually care about as podcasters and business owners. This is how Apple can track, your episode consumption rate and percentage of listeners and engaged listeners. Your podcast host tracks downloads, while podcast listening apps like Apple and Spotify track the number of streams and listens. So now that you have this fresh perspective, how many monthly podcast downloads do you think are necessary to convert your podcast listeners into your paid offers and programs? Truthfully, that depends on you. It depends on the type of content you create. Are you setting your podcast up like a sales funnel to meet your listeners at each stage of the customer journey? Now, I talked about this back in episode 230 and walk you through how to set up a podcast sales funnel. I also support you in setting up your podcast sales funnel inside of my podcast with strategy, coaching, and consulting offer. And so if you want that type of support to be able to set this up to actually start making money from your podcast, head on over to mamatermompreneur.com/podcast with strategy. But these are some questions you need to be asking yourself. Are you selling in your podcast content? Also, what is your current conversion rate? So for instance, if you have like a 10% conversion rate and you have 30 people tuning into your podcast each week, you should be able to convert 3 of those 30 people into your offers. So to answer the question, there is no specific number of downloads you have to reach to start making sales from your podcast. So to give you like a real life example of what is possible, I'm going to share with you my stats and really share with you like what it looks like to set up a podcast sales funnel and how that can work for you. So when I first launched my podcast, I launched it back in October 2022. Around that time, I averaged about 30 to 35 downloads per episode within the first 7 days. And then within 6 months of launching my podcast, and 3 months of truly creating content that fed into my sales funnel, that fed into my offers, I signed my first client from my podcast. So, like I said, the first 3 months with my podcast, I did not really leverage my podcast as part of my marketing and sales strategy. I talked about this in previous episodes. I can't even think which one. But essentially, I kind of held back a lot because I saw a lot of other people who were doing what I wanted to do. And I had the mindset drama of like, oh, I don't want to copy them and stuff like that. And so I wasn't really actively selling on my podcast, nor was I creating content that was geared towards my offers that would funnel into my offers. And so I played around essentially for 3 months. And then by the time I hit that 4 month mark, I was like, you know what? Why am I creating this podcast? And I started creating content around my offers. And so by doing that consistently for 3 months, I was able to sign my first client. Now with my podcast, I'm, 2025. So I've had the podcast. It'll be 3 years, October 2025. But now I average about 50 to 60 downloads per episode within the first 7 days. Now I often have outlier episodes that exceed, that 60 downloads. So I have some episodes that have hit 70 or 80 downloads within the first week or so. And as time goes on, those numbers do go up. And then I also have some that, are on the lower end within that first 7 days where it's around 40 to 50 downloads for that episode. Like I said, a lot of my older episodes, they're past the 70 and 80 downloads. And there are even some that are past 100 downloads. So that's to kind of give you the perspective of the downloads. Now to dig a little bit deeper into the analytics. So my average monthly episode consumption rate is between 68 and 70%. So I calculate the average for all of the episodes drop within that month. Like I've mentioned in previous episodes, I track my analytics every month. So the first of the month, I track all of my analytics. I like to gather the averages instead of looking at the individual episodes. So I have about a 68 to 70% average consumption rate, which is good because your goal should be a consumption rate of 60% or higher for each episode, meaning that people are listening to more than half of your episodes. And so that's for the consumption rate. My percentage of engaged listeners is about 70%. Now, engaged listeners are those who listen to about 40% or 20 minutes of each episode. That's how Apple Podcasts define it. So those are my numbers essentially with my podcast. And even with these numbers and having what is considered to be a small podcast audience, I sign clients for my podcast almost monthly. So to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, last year in Q4, so October, November, December, so I signed 3 clients for my podcast in October and then 2 in December. Now, November was a no sales month for me because I was not selling. I was just engaging with and nurturing my audience. So the month before I had sold out my accelerator. And so I honestly just wanted to take a little break from selling to my audience and just really just engage with them, nurture them, love on them and all of that. Not to say I don't do that throughout the year, but I think also just with it being November, Thanksgiving, and then I knew they're about to get bombarded with Black Friday stuff and all of that, I decided to give back for the month of November. Also, when I say, there were no sales for November, I'm saying that there was no new sales. So between my membership, as well as some of my one-on-one offers in which clients are on, monthly payment plans, I had recurring revenue coming in for the month of November. So I make sure to stack my offers in a way so that way I always have money coming in. So even in those months where I happen to not have any new sales, I still have income coming in. So I just wanted to add in that little side note. But that kind of gives you a general idea of how my podcast work for me. So, like I said, I typically monthly will make sales for my podcast where people are saying that they found me through my podcast, they heard about the offer on my podcast, and that's what made them decide to join the offer and different things like that. Okay, so to give another example to really drive this point home about downloads and them not really telling you much about what is actually going on with your podcast or not, basically making that the determining factor of whether or not your podcast is successful. So I worked with a client who, when she first came to me, she was already at over 200,000 podcast downloads. She had a very large podcast audience, but she had never made a sale from her podcast. So she was in the decluttering space. She supported moms with decluttering their homes, helping them declutter their kids' toys, all of the things. And she heard a lot from her listeners about how much they loved her podcast, how they were able to implement the things that she was sharing on the podcast, but she never made a sale. She had a digital course that walked them through, different ways to declutter and just all of the nuances that comes with decluttering and whatnot, working through the mindset drama when it comes to decluttering. It was an amazing course, but no one from her podcast, none of her listeners were buying her course. And so when she came to me, that was the first thing we focused on. I audited her podcast and really looked at where her gaps were. And then I taught her my income framework. This is the framework that I teach my clients inside of Podcast with Strategy. It is the framework that I apply to my podcast. And this framework really helps you to, one, make sure you're growing your podcast with the right people, the people who need what you have to offer. And then two, it helps you to actually sell your offers on your podcast and see those conversions. And so after implementing this, within 3 months of implementing the income framework, she made her first 3 sales from her podcast. And it was that simple, just making those tweaks. But it didn't matter that she had this huge audience. She wasn't making any money from it. Yes, she was hearing, how amazing her podcast was and how much of an impact it was making on her listeners, but no one was buying her course. Her podcast was not part of her funnel. She was not leveraging it in a way that could really support her business. And so that is what I'm getting at. It does not matter the number of downloads. You could be getting 100 downloads a week. You could be getting thousands and thousands of downloads per week and still not be making any sales from your podcast. And that's what matters as a business owner. Yes, we are using these platforms to build community and everything, but also we do not have time to waste. We cannot just be creating content to create content for content's sake. We need to be creating content that is going to actually support our business, that is going to bring in those leads, nurture those leads, and convert them into our offers. So this is why I really wanted to do this episode, because I see it all the time, people getting so hyper-focused on their downloads and trying to increase their downloads when they're not even making sales based at the level of downloads they're currently getting. And so growing your audience is not going to increase your sales. It's so much deeper than that. So yeah, I just wanted to give these examples so you guys can see, one, with me, I have a small audience by industry standards, but I'm still converting my listeners into my offers. And then I've worked with people who've had way larger audiences than me, and they weren't making any sales. So that tells you right there that downloads are not the most important thing that you need to be looking at when you're a business owner with a podcast. So I share all of this to say that you can sign clients from your podcast regardless of the number of downloads you get. The reality is that downloads don't give you a full picture of what your podcast listeners are doing or how many podcast listeners you actually have. As a business owner with a podcast, your focus needs to be different. You are not an influencer, and your top priority needs to be monetizing with your own offers, not sponsorships, not brand deals, not even affiliate income. So to monetize with your own offers, you need to set up a podcast like a sales funnel. Create content that meets people at each stage of the customer journey and sell in your podcast content. The definition of a successful podcast for you is the number of conversions you're seeing from your podcast and the impact that you are making on your listeners' lives and business. So if you're not sure what steps you need to take to start converting your podcast listeners into clients, join me inside Podcast with Strategy. I will support you in mapping out strategic podcast content that will turn your podcast into a client magnet. Like, it doesn't have to be complicated. Like I said, people harp on downloads so much, and they're really just vanity metrics, but they don't really tell you what you need to know when you are really trying to leverage your podcast as part of your marketing and sales strategy. I want you to be focusing on actually signing clients from your podcast, actually growing your podcast audience with people who actually want to buy from you at some point. We're not just growing our audience to grow our audience. And so if you are someone who you've been at it for a while and you're not seeing, higher downloads, or maybe you're just feeling like, dang, I'm only getting, 20 downloads per episode, or 30 downloads per episode, or 10 downloads per episode. I want you to look at it this way. Those are 10, 20, 30 people who they're potentially tuning into your podcast each week. We don't know for sure because, like I said, the downloads don't really give us a definitive answer whether or not people are listening. But if you're consistently seeing that number, you know that there are some people who are tuning in. And so I don't care if it's 5 people tuning into each episode. You have 5 people tuning into your podcast every single week. That's huge. I mean, if you were in a room pitching your services to 5 people, you would feel great about that, So think of it the same way. So don't get so caught up in the downloads, but really look at, okay, am I connecting with my listeners? Am I creating content that is going to move them along the customer journey so that way they can make that decision to move forward with working with me so that I can support them? Are you getting those messages from people sharing how much your podcast is impacting their lives and their business and different things like that? Because if you are, you're making a difference, right? And so the next thing is, okay, we need to move them along the funnel. We need to move them on down so they can make that decision and move forward with working with you. So if you are in that space where you're feeling stuck or you're just not seeing the conversions you desire to see, Podcast with Strategy is perfect for you. We will really map out that content so that way you can set up your podcast sales funnel and you can actually start to see that return on investment. So head on over to momaturnedmompreneur.com/podcast with strategy to sign up today. All right, Mama, I'll catch you in the next episode. Hey, Mama. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. I would love to keep the conversation going. So head to momaturnedmompreneur.com/marketing without socials to join my email community. I share even more tips and strategies for building a business that doesn't rely on social media and one that fits your current season of life, as well as more behind the scenes of mom and business life. All right, Mama, that's it for today, but I'll catch up with you again next week.